In the hushed moments before 6:05 on a Baghdad morning, a dictator's life reached its violent conclusion. As the world's attention fixed upon the final grim moments of Saddam Hussein on December 30th, 2006, two women watched from the deep shadows of exile. Their own futures, once secured by his power, now hung by the thinnest of threads. These were the women who had shared his bed, borne his children, and stood witness to the terrifying rise and fall of his regime. For decades, Sajida Talfah and Samira Shahbandar had navigated a life of both unimaginable opulence and paralyzing fear. They walked the marble halls of presidential palaces, wore jewels worth millions, and learned to command terror with a mere glance. But as the trapdoor fell, their gilded cages did not simply open. They shattered. The fate that awaited them in the aftermath would prove more shocking than anyone could have predicted. To understand the devastation of their fall, one must first comprehend the perilous heights from which these women were thrown. In the gilded cage of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, family was just another battlefield, and marriage was a weapon of state. His union with Sajida Talfah in 1963 was never a romance. It was a calculated fusion of bloodlines. As his first cousin and the daughter of his mentor, Khairallah Talfah, she was a living link to his own origins, a woman forged from the same harsh Tikriti soil who understood the brutal arithmetic of survival. For years, Sajida was a formidable power in her own right. Those who moved within the palace walls spoke of a woman with a ferocious intellect and a temper to match the dictator's own. She gave him 5 children, Uday, Qusay, Raghad, Rana, and Hala, and stood as the undisputed First Lady, one of the few souls on earth who could challenge Saddam's will without facing immediate destruction. She wielded her influence with precision, but her position was not unassailable. The foundations of her world began to tremble in the 1980s with the arrival of Samira Shahbandar. Blonde, sophisticated, and educated in the West, Samira was the antithesis of the traditional Sajida. When she caught Saddam's eye, she was already married to an airline executive, an obstacle the dictator swiftly removed by having the man reassigned. In 1986, Saddam secretly made Samira his second wife. This clandestine marriage created a deep rift within the regime's inner circle. While Sajida embodied the old Iraq of tribal loyalties, Samira was groomed to represent Saddam's aspirations for a modern, polished image, accompanying him where Sajida's rougher edges were deemed unsuitable. A silent war simmered between the two women, a rivalry of honor and influence that was destined to spill blood. The tension finally exploded in 1995. At a party crowded with guests, Sajida's firstborn son, Uday, murdered Kamel Hanagejeo, Saddam's personal valet and the man who had first introduced Samira to the dictator. It was a twisted public defense of his mother's honor, but the act backfired with spectacular violence. Enraged, Saddam reportedly beat his son with a cane and had him imprisoned. Caught between her husband's volcanic fury and her fierce maternal instinct, Sajida made a fateful choice. She sided with Uday. The family fractured, cleaving along lines of loyalty that would never mend. Sajida retreated to her own compound, a ghost in the regime she helped build, while Samira's star ascended. Yet, as the 1990s wore on and sanctions strangled the nation, both women watched their golden world tarnish, trapped by the growing paranoia of the man they both served. They were survivors, but they could not see the true storm gathering just beyond the horizon, a storm that would finally break on March 20th, 2003. The sky above Baghdad tore open on the 20th of March, 2003. As the first explosions of the American invasion shuddered through the city, the lives of two women, already on opposite sides of a crumbling palace, were sent down irrevocably different paths. Long estranged from her husband, Sajida had been watching the horizon for signs of this very storm. From her separate compound, she methodically erased the past, burning documents and moving assets, guided by a grim and certain knowledge. Years at the center of a brutal regime had taught her its most unforgiving logic. When power collapses, the ruler's family is the first to be consumed. By the 9th of April, as American armor ground through the streets of the capital, Sajida and her daughters were already ghosts. Their swift, silent flight across the border into Jordan was not an act of desperation, but the final, calculated move in a long and patient strategy for survival. This was an extraction planned with the cold precision of a woman who knew her world was ending. Samira, the favored mistress, had remained closer to the heart of power until the very end. Intelligence sources would later recall seeing her with Saddam in a series of safe houses during the invasion's first chaotic days. But as the net tightened and the dictator vanished completely, so did she. Her escape route led to Lebanon, her passage secured not by family ties, but by a fortune in cash and jewels. She moved like a phantom through Beirut's banking districts, converting her assets, severing her connections, and trying to build a new identity from the ashes of the old. One woman sought refuge in the ancient bonds of tribe and family, the other in the cold anonymity of wealth. Meanwhile, the hunt for Saddam himself intensified. For 8 months he eluded his pursuers, a ghost in his own land, protected by a dwindling circle of loyalists. From their separate exiles, both Sajida and Samira maintained an absolute suffocating silence. They understood that in the new Iraq, any association with the fallen leader was a death sentence. Then, on the 13th of December, the world saw the unthinkable. Pulled from a dark hole in the ground near Tikrit, the once feared dictator was a bearded, disheveled captive. The images flickered across television screens in Jordan and Lebanon, where 2 women bore witness to the humiliation of the man who had defined their lives. His capture was not an end to their ordeal, but the beginning of a new, more dangerous chapter. The years between his arrest and his execution would become the most precarious they had ever faced, trapped in a limbo between a past that was dead and a future that would not let them be free. In the quiet corners of exile, their old world had become a ghost. They existed in a legal twilight, neither fully free nor entirely captive, caught between international law and the shifting sands of regional politics. Sajida, along with her daughters Ragad and Rana, had found a fragile refuge in Jordan, initially welcomed as guests of the royal family. King Abdullah II, navigating a perilous path between his Western allies and the sentiments of the Arab street, granted them sanctuary on humanitarian grounds. Yet this mercy came with ironclad conditions: no political activity, no public statements, and a complete severance of ties with any Iraqi resistance. They were given a respectable villa in Amman's affluent Abdoun district, a world away from the gilded palaces of Baghdad, yet a comfortable prison nonetheless. Comfort, however, was a thin veneer. Sajida lived under the constant hum of surveillance, her every movement tracked by Jordanian intelligence. Her telephone conversations were recorded, her visitors meticulously vetted. She was at liberty to travel within Jordan's borders, but leaving the country required permission she was unlikely to receive. It was a golden cage, merely of a different design. Financial pressures began to mount with alarming speed. The millions Sajida had managed to spirit out of Iraq were rapidly dwindling, consumed by legal fees for Saddam's defense, the support of her children and grandchildren, and the high cost of living in Amman. Accounts from this time paint a portrait of a woman selling her jewelry, piece by painful piece, each transaction a quiet surrender of her former life. Her daughters, Ragad and Rana, carried their own deep scars. Both were widows of the Kamel brothers, who had defected to Jordan in 1995, only to be lured back to Iraq and executed on Saddam's orders. Now, they raised their own children in the shadow of that trauma, their past a nightmare and their future a void. Ragad, more politically inclined and fiercely proud, chafed under the enforced silence. That simmering tension finally erupted in July of 2006. Jordanian authorities claimed to have discovered Ragad in contact with Iraqi insurgent groups, allegedly funneling funds for operations against the new government in Baghdad. Whether this was a genuine plot or a convenient pretext for Jordan to distance itself from the toxic legacy of the Hussein family is still debated. The result, however, was undeniable. Sajida watched, helpless, as her daughter became a wanted woman. For Samira in Lebanon, the situation was just as precarious, though its character was starkly different. Lebanon, with its fractured politics and weak central government, could not offer the structured sanctuary of Jordan. Instead, Samira navigated a treacherous world of fixers, lawyers, and businessmen, each taking a portion of her vanishing fortune as she struggled to survive. She ghosted through Lebanon's cities, moving constantly between Beirut, Sidon, and Tripoli, never staying in one place for more than a few months. She was a fugitive, always one step ahead of Iraqi agents seeking retribution and international investigators hunting for Saddam's hidden wealth. The woman who once commanded the attention of a nation now fought desperately to remain invisible. These financial investigations posed a particular threat to Samira. As Saddam's second wife, she had been more deeply enmeshed in his labyrinthine international dealings. Investigators traced a complex web of transactions through Swiss banks, Austrian real estate, and French companies, with many trails leading back to accounts she had helped create. Every frozen asset was another bar on her cage. From their separate exiles, both women watched the televised spectacle of Saddam's trial. The man who had ruled through absolute fear now stood in a dock, a defiant figure arguing with judges and disrupting the proceedings. Through it all, Sajida and Samira remained silent, their public stoicism betraying nothing of the storm within. When the death sentence was handed down on November 5, 2006, it was an outcome they had long foreseen. Their ordeal was entering a new, more dangerous phase. They would no longer be the wives of a captured dictator, but the widows of an executed one. A cold shadow fell long before the sun rose. In the pre-dawn chill of December 30th, 2006, Saddam Hussein walked toward the gallows, his final moments captured in the grainy, unsteady frame of a mobile phone camera. As his executioner's taunts echoed in the small room, two women in two different countries braced for the news that would sever the last threads, binding them to a life of power. The footage, leaked to the world, broadcast not just the end of a dictator, but a seismic shift in their fragile reality. In her Amman villa, surrounded by her daughters, the 69-year-old Sajida received the news. Witnesses described a scene of immense controlled grief, a silence that stretched for hours, broken only by murmured prayers. There was no wailing, no dramatic collapse. Decades of proximity to violence had taught her that public displays of emotion were a weakness that could be exploited. But this private grief was soon eclipsed by a very public humiliation. Under both Islamic law and Iraqi tribal custom, Sajida, as the first wife, held the right to her husband's body and his burial. The Iraqi government, however, fearing his grave would become a shrine for insurgents, had other plans. They interred him swiftly and secretly in his birthplace of Al-Auja, denying his family the right to attend, a profound violation of cultural and religious duty. This denial cut deeper than the execution itself. Sajida's attempts to claim the remains, working through Jordanian intermediaries, were rebuffed at every turn. While Saddam lived, even in a cell, his wives retained a certain untouchable quality. Now, they were merely the family of an executed war criminal, and the thin protection that status had afforded them began to dissolve into air. For Samira in Lebanon, the danger was immediate and visceral. Within days, death threats began to arrive as Iraqi Shia groups, empowered by the execution, called for retribution. The Lebanese authorities, long uncomfortable with her presence, made it clear her sanctuary was gone. Her flight was a desperate affair, traveling by car with false documents to slip across the border into Syria. It was a temporary haven, but safety, she was learning, was only ever an illusion. In the quiet confines of her Jordanian exile, the echoes of the execution gave way to a new and pressing threat. Saddam's death had emboldened the new Iraqi government, which now formally demanded the extradition of all remaining Hussein family members. They sought Sajida and her daughters not for specific crimes, but as living symbols of the old regime to be put on trial before the world. Jordan refused, citing humanitarian grounds, yet the political pressure was immense. King Abdullah found himself navigating a treacherous path between his own people, many of whom saw Saddam as a symbol of Arab defiance, and his powerful Western and Gulf allies, who wanted the Hussein legacy erased. The quiet compromise was a campaign of slow attrition, a bureaucratic tightening of the screws intended to make their lives so restricted that they would simply leave. Sajida's world began to shrink. Her residency permit was made temporary. Its renewal required every few months in a ritual of bureaucratic humiliation. Access to her remaining funds was choked off, and most painfully, visits from several of her grandchildren were denied, severing her from the family's next generation. For a woman who had spent decades at the apex of power, where her slightest whim was law, the transition to a powerless supplicant was absolute and crushing. But perhaps the most bitter wound was inflicted from within. The execution did not unite the family in grief. It exposed the long-simmering fractures between Saddam's children and relatives. Some publicly disavowed Sajida and Samira, hoping to build new lives free from the family name. Others cast blame, accusing the wives of failing to save Saddam or secure the family's fortune. The House of Hussein, once bound by absolute power, now began to devour itself in the shadows of exile. For the survivors, the fall of Baghdad was not an end, but the beginning of a slower, colder war against time and memory. Each passing year brought fresh humiliations, a constant reminder of the great height from which they had fallen. Sajida's sanctuary in Jordan began to feel more like a prison. In 2007, the new Iraqi government placed her on its most wanted list, the reward for her capture turning her into a pariah. Though Jordan refused to extradite her, the designation poisoned her existence. Police grew wary of handling her accounts, and lawyers hesitated to take her calls. Even the opulent shops in Amman, where she had once been a prized customer, now saw her as a dangerous liability. The financial pressure became a suffocating weight as the initial stipend from the Jordanian government was reduced, then reduced again. By 2008, whispers emerged of Sajida secretly selling her last treasures, including a diamond necklace once looted from the Kuwaiti royal family. Each sale was a furtive transaction, the buyers keenly aware of her desperation, offering only a fraction of the jewel's worth. Her health, too, began to betray her. The immense stress of exile, compounded by age and the absence of elite medical care, took its toll in the form of diabetes and a deep depression she refused to acknowledge. In a culture where such struggles were a source of shame, Sajida clung to a facade of strength even as she was breaking apart inside. Her daughters navigated their own gilded cages. Raghad, targeted by an Interpol notice in 2007 for allegedly funding terrorism, was effectively imprisoned in Jordan. She could not travel, could not legally work, and lived under the constant shadow of assassination as Iraqi intelligence made it clear they considered her a legitimate target. Rana, the younger daughter, kept a lower profile, but her challenges were just as profound. Her children, Saddam's grandchildren, grew up stateless, denied Iraqi citizenship and unable to claim Jordanian nationality. They attended private schools under false names, their classmates oblivious to the legacy of the family sitting beside them. The family's isolation became absolute in 2008 when Jordan closed the Iraqi embassy section that handled their affairs. This seemingly small bureaucratic act had devastating consequences, severing their last official channel to their homeland. They were now non-persons, existing in a legal limbo with no one to turn to. Across the border in Syria, Samira's fate was unfolding along a different but equally tragic path. She initially found a measure of security in Damascus, sheltered by an Assad regime that kept ties with former Ba'athists as leverage against Baghdad. Living in a modest apartment in the Mazi district, she was surrounded by both surveillance and protection. For a brief period, between roughly 2007 and 2010, Samira achieved a fragile stability. She had salvaged enough money to live comfortably and had faded from the public eye, returning to a forgotten passion from her youth. Reports from this time describe her painting, creating abstract works that she never showed to anyone. But this quiet existence was shattered by the Arab Spring. As Syria descended into civil war in 2011, Samira's protected status evaporated. The Assad regime, now fighting for its own survival, could no longer shield its Iraqi exiles. The Mazi district became a battlefield, forcing her to flee once more, this time with almost nothing. The woman who once traveled in private jets now joined the endless streams of refugees heading for the Turkish border. But unlike the anonymous faces in the crowd, her identity was a brand she could never escape. In the shifting shadows of a fractured Middle East, a name could be a death sentence. For Samira Shahbandar, her very identity made her a target for Iraqi agents seeking vengeance, Syrian rebels who branded her a collaborator, and extremists who saw in her the face of a secular regime they despised. She became a ghost, moving between safe houses across northern Syria, her life depending on a shrinking circle of former Ba'athists who were themselves being hunted. What little money remained was not for escape, but for bribes, small payments to purchase another day of life. By 2012, whispers placed her in Turkey, a phantom presence the government would never officially acknowledge. Meanwhile, the consequences of Syria's implosion rippled outward, reaching Sajida Talfah in Jordan. A massive wave of refugees poured across the border, straining the kingdom's resources and fraying its nerves. Amid the humanitarian crisis, official tolerance for the Hussein family evaporated and pressure mounted for them to leave. But there was nowhere left to run. No nation on earth would welcome the widow of Saddam Hussein. After a full decade in exile, the initial shock had given way to a slow, grinding desperation. They were women, stripped of everything but their name, having sold every last valuable and exhausted every fragile connection. The world had moved on. The Iraq War, a fading memory for all but those who still thirsted for revenge. They were living relics, trapped in a past that refused to let them go. While Sajida and Samira wrestled with their own fading existence, a far deeper tragedy was unfolding: the systematic destruction of the next generation. Saddam's grandchildren, innocent of his crimes, now bore the full, crushing weight of his legacy. In Jordan, Sajida watched helplessly as her grandson Ali, the son of Uday, excelled in school under an assumed name. But when he applied to university in 2010, his true identity was exposed. His application was not just rejected, he was expelled from high school, the sins of the grandfather becoming an inescapable curse upon the grandson. The younger children, many born in exile, existed in a state of permanent limbo. They were Jordanian in culture, but denied citizenship, Iraqi by blood, but barred from their homeland. Some tried to shed the Hussein name to disappear into new countries, but in an age of facial recognition and global databases, anonymity was a fantasy. The psychological toll was immense, with many suffering from depression and anxiety, their status making even therapy a complicated ordeal. Every knock on the door, every official letter carried the potential for disaster. This fragile existence shattered in 2014 with the rise of ISIS. The extremist group, hoping to rally former Ba'athists, made overtures to the Hussein family, placing them in an impossible position. Any hint of association would mean immediate expulsion from Jordan, yet refusal could invite the group's murderous wrath. The mere possibility of such a connection was enough to intensify surveillance and tighten the restrictions that already governed their lives. By 2015, the damage was plain to see. Several grandchildren, their futures blocked, descended into substance abuse. Universities and companies, fearing social media campaigns, refused to accept anyone connected to Saddam. For the young women, even marriage was a fraught affair. Potential suitors were scared away by the name, while those who were not often sought a hidden family fortune that no longer existed. As the decade wore on, time began to run out. The relentless pressure of age, illness, and exile pushed Sajida toward her final chapter. After 2015, her health collapsed. Worsening diabetes, heart problems, and untreated depression took their toll. And by the following year, she was confined to her villa in Amman. Her world had shrunk to just a few rooms, her past a grand palace, her present a quiet prison. The echoes of power faded into a desperate silence. Now, the family subsisted on loans from the few friends still willing to risk the association, a profound humiliation for a woman who had once commanded millions. In her only known interview from this period, conducted through intermediaries, Sajida offered no words of remorse. She spoke only of her family, of duty, and of the great injustice she felt had befallen them. Even at the precipice of her own end, she would not break from the defiant narrative that had defined her life. Samira Shahbandar's final years, meanwhile, were a descent into even deeper obscurity. After fleeing Syria, she simply vanished, becoming a ghost in the intelligence reports of nations from Turkey to Qatar and Russia, none of them ever confirmed. Unlike Sajida, who had her daughters, Samira was utterly alone, with no children from her time with Saddam and a birth family that had long since cast her out. The few who claimed to have seen her described a woman hollowed out by fate. The brilliant blonde hair that had once captivated a dictator had turned to gray, her fashionable clothes replaced by the anonymous dress of the unseen. A dangerous myth of hidden wealth haunted both women, drawing con artists and treasure hunters who were convinced they guarded a secret fortune. This cruel illusion made their poverty a liability, as criminal groups mounted several kidnapping attempts for a ransom that did not exist. Each foiled plot was a violent reminder that they would never truly escape Saddam's shadow. By the year 2020, both women were in their 80s, with failing health and exhausted resources. The COVID-19 pandemic then descended, enforcing a final suffocating isolation that sealed them off from the world. Their end, when it finally arrived, was as quiet and inevitable as their last years in exile, forgotten by a world that had already moved on. In the shadows of exile, the final chapter began not with a bang, but with a whisper. The first to vanish was Samira, though the details of her end are shrouded in rumor and official silence. Whispers emerged in 2020 of her death, possibly in Turkey, but no government would confirm it. There was no public funeral, no obituary to mark her passing. It was as if she had been meticulously erased from existence, a final act of the anonymity she had sought in life. Those few who claimed to know spoke of a lonely death in a hospital bed under a false name, with no family to witness her final moments. Her body was reportedly consigned to an unmarked grave, its location a state secret. Even in death, her name was a political contagion, too dangerous to acknowledge openly. A year later, in 2021, Sajida followed. The circumstances of her passing were just as obscure, with no government issuing a formal statement. Instead, Iraqi media carried the news, citing family sources who could not agree on the date or the cause. She died not in the gilded palaces of Baghdad, but in the same modest villa that had been her world for 2 decades of exile, a world away from Saddam's tomb in Tikrit. Her burial became a final delicate diplomatic puzzle. Islamic tradition demanded a swift interment, but the question was where? Iraq refused to accept her remains, while Jordan, her reluctant host, wanted no permanent monument to her presence. She was laid to rest in a secret Jordanian cemetery, a measure to prevent her grave from becoming either a shrine for loyalists or a target for her husband's enemies. Neither woman received the grand state funeral that their former status might have commanded. They were buried as quietly as they had lived their final years, their graves as anonymous as their lives had become. The reaction to their deaths was telling in its profound silence. In Iraq, there were no celebrations, but there was no sympathy either. They had faded into footnotes of history, their deaths little more than administrative loose ends to be tied up discreetly. Among expatriates, feelings were fractured. Some mourned a link to a lost, gilded past, while others felt their quiet suffering was insufficient justice. The wider world, which had once tracked their movements by satellite, barely registered their passing. The women who had been hunted by global intelligence agencies died without causing a ripple, their deaths drawing a quiet line under an entire era. With them went the last living connections to Saddam's inner sanctum and whatever secrets they held about the regime's hidden wealth. But perhaps the most enduring tragedy was not their own, but the one they left behind for their family. Their children and grandchildren were left more exposed than ever, stripped of even the minimal protection the widow's quiet presence had afforded. Raghad and Rana, Sajida's daughters, remain in Jordan, a testament that the curse of the first generation had truly become the burden of the third. The years in exile bled one into the next, a slow current of borrowed time. Their situation had become a permanent state of precarity, with both Raghad and her mother now in their 50s, their entire adult lives having unfolded in the shadow of another country. They had watched their children grow up stateless, seeing opportunities evaporate under the glare of constant surveillance. Raghad's attempts to salvage the family's reputation, giving interviews that painted her father as a misunderstood patriot, had only backfired. Her voice, intended to bring them in from the cold, instead deepened their isolation and landed her on international wanted lists, forever anchoring her to Jordan. The grandchildren's search for normalcy met with a bitter futility. A few escaped to places where the Hussein name carried less weight, like Yemen or Sudan, but they lived in the perpetual fear of discovery. Others remained trapped in Jordan, existing in a suffocating legal limbo, unable to work, forbidden to travel. Now, the curse extends to a fourth generation. Saddam's great-grandchildren are born into this same stateless existence, haunted by a legacy they cannot comprehend and a past they can never escape. The family's financial desperation is a constant, grinding reality. Whatever hidden fortune Saddam had amassed was now seized, frozen, or simply lost to the chaos. They survive on the quiet charity of sympathizers in whatever informal work they can find. Though human rights organizations raise concerns for children punished for crimes not their own, Iraqi and Jordanian authorities remain unmoved. The family, they argue, is not persecuted, merely denied a privilege they no longer deserve. Studies of the family reveal a deep and lasting trauma, a psychological wound passed from one generation to the next. Attempts to sell memoirs have been met with wariness from publishers and outrage from victims, reinforcing their status as pariahs. In Iraq, the government shows no sign of softening its stance, not while politicians can still win votes by being tough on the Husseins. In the end, even the dead find no peace. The graves of Sajida and her daughter Samira lie unmarked and unvisited in foreign soil, their locations a secret kept even from their own children. A final, silent testament to the absolute price of power. The fall of a tyrant is never a clean break. Its aftershocks ripple outward, swallowing not just the guilty, but generations to come. The stories of Sajida Talfah and Samira Shahbandar became a testament to this truth, a tragedy of an entire system that lifted them to unimaginable heights, only to cast them into absolute oblivion. They had made their choices, marrying a dictator and remaining by his side through decades of brutality. Whether they possessed any real alternative in an Iraq where dissent meant death is a question for history. but they reaped the rewards of a system built on terror, and in the end, they would pay a cost beyond reckoning. The immense wealth, the untouchable status, the very ground of their homeland, all of it was stripped away, leaving them adrift in a world that now despised them. They were forced to watch their children suffer and their grandchildren grow up as stateless wanderers. Their own lives ended in the quiet loneliness of exile, their final resting places unknown, their stories reduced to mere footnotes in their husbands' monstrous legacy. While their complicity may earn little sympathy, their fate raises difficult questions about inherited guilt. What of the grandchildren born in exile who never knew Iraq but still carry the weight of its history? The palaces where they once held court now stand as ruins or serve other masters. The fear they once commanded became the fear they lived with every day. For those living under the protection of other dictatorships, the fate of the Hussein wives offered a chilling preview of how quickly the luxuries and securities of power can vanish. With their deaths, the Hussein dynasty was effectively extinguished. Its descendants survive as shadows scattered across the globe, their name a burden rather than a blessing. It was not a dramatic end, but a slow, grinding erosion, a descent from martyrdom into marginalization. They were not even afforded the dignity of being remembered as individuals, but only as extensions of their infamous husband. History's final verdict was not a single violent act, but a long, quiet disgrace, and it proved that those who rise by such means never fall alone.